And I'll introduce these mental upgrades in three different concepts. The idea of a complexity crisis, the idea of critical systems that we've talked about quite a bit, and some new idea I'm playing with, which I call complexity claustrophobia. So in a recent paper, Geoff West and I argued that we're experiencing something unique in human history. And the thing we're experiencing uniquely is a complexity crisis. And that is the collapse or near collapse of multiple coupled complex systems, not just one or the other. So let me just give you some data to make that point clearer. Everyone knows this slide. This is a slide of time in months in the year 2020 against incident of COVID infection and the S&P 500 index. And you can see very early in the year, they were strongly negatively coupled. An increase in COVID infection led to a concomitant reduction in the value of the market. But something interesting happened later in the year, they became somewhat decoupled. And if anything, maybe they're even negatively correlated now. And it's not just markets, it's also human beings, in the sense that there was a recent paper published on 6,000 companies, small companies, where the average number of layoffs was about 40%. So this is real lives. Here's another set of correlations which shows the compositional heterogeneity of the effect. So this is the capital asset pricing model. And here you can see some trends are positively correlated, in this case, utilities, healthcare, and telecom, whereas others, energy, transportation, the automobile sector, negatively correlated. And all of us are familiar with the final one because of the effect of COVID on our social lives, a huge reduction in the ability to go out and socialize, in this particular case, reduction in ability to go to restaurants. So all of these systems have been perturbed by COVID. Let's look back to 1918, and this gets to a point that David made. This is what happened to the Dow Jones Industrial Average with the Great Flu of 1918, which killed vastly more people and infected a third of the planet. Basically nothing. It's interesting that in this paper, there's a trend line that's been put in that says minus 10% at the highest peak. No one in our community would have drawn that line. It's not above the stochastic null expectation. I think it was drawn there because they wanted there to be an effect felt by the market. And if you look at more contemporary epidemics, it's even worse. If I were to ask you, what is the impact of an epidemic, in this case on stock performance, you'd probably say it's positive. In other words, all of those black points seem to occur prior to an increase in value, not a decline. So this is when we say complexity crisis, what we mean is that historically, a perturbation such as COVID has been largely invisible. Whereas in all of these indicators today, you have all of these positive and negative correlations emerging. And the question is why? So I now want to talk about criticality. This is a famous model. It's not the one that I work on, but it's known as the model of self-organized criticality, or the sand pile model. Here, if you were to drop grains of sand onto the ground, you would build up a sand pile. And eventually you'd hit a critical slope where you'd find avalanches of sand falling down the sides. And what happens in this model is that by virtue of these avalanches falling, you flatten the slope, you move back to the non-critical state until you build up enough sand to reach the critical state where you find avalanches appear again. This is called self-organized criticality because it's a slowly driven, nonlinear dynamical system that tunes to a critical point. And at that critical point, you see avalanches that have a characteristic parallel distribution, some very large and some relatively small. So over the course of SFI's history, a number of us have been interested in the following question. Do all complex systems, things much more complex than sand piles, exhibit criticality? And on the left is a well-known paper by our colleague Ricard Solé with Per Back, on ecological systems. Here's one by John Rundle, I think is on the line today, a review of critical systems, and a couple of our papers recently on conflict. And all of these papers collectively suggest that adaptive systems tend to be tuned to near critical points where they'll manifest this avalanche-like behavior. And this gets to the second point that I really want to make clearly, the difference between a critical perturbation and a critical system. There's nothing special about a sand grain, right? What's special is the disposition of the sand pile, the critical system. And if you drop a sand grain at the critical point, there's the possibility of eliciting an avalanche. The same is true of COVID. There's been a huge amount of focus on the virus, that is the critical perturbation, but much less attention paid to the critical system that exists independently of the virus and will exist when the virus goes away and be susceptible to perturbations into the future. Here's a nice example, the so-called football war between El Salvador and Honduras, where people say a football game that was a World Cup game where Honduras won 1-0 led to a war. But of course, it wasn't the football that led to the war. It was the pre-existing patterns of immigration and tensions around that that led to a national state that could be set on fire by something as trivial as scoring a goal, or not as trivial, I don't know, maybe that's not trivial. And finally, a bullet. This is, of course, the famous case of the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. Of course, it wasn't the assassination, right? It was the growing nationalism, imperialism, and the alliance between nations that led to a domino effect. So the critical perturbation might have been the shot, but if you really wanted to understand what was going to happen, you'd have to study the critical system. And I think much of our discussion is centered on critical perturbations and has to shift towards studying whether or not the systems we care about and live in are near critical. Because, you know, if you have a house of cards, even a flea landing on it will knock it over. So that's the second point. The third point I just mentioned, sort of slightly flip, is this notion of claustrophobia. It's something we're all experiencing a little, locked up. And where does that come from? Well, it was first used by Benjamin Ball, where he defined claustrophobia as the fear of enclosed spaces. It was just a definition with no cause. Freud made an effort to explain where it came from. And Freud suggested that we have some anxiety, some fear, that moves along some pattern of associations that finally ends up projected onto some object, which he called the phobic object, which in this case was the enclosed space. So, right, so we have an anxiety associated with some pattern in the world, it moves through associations to become projected on the space. And I want to claim that in 2020, we're suffering from complexity claustrophobia. The anxiety in this case is our uncertainty and incomprehension of the complex world. The associative path leads it to be projected onto a phobic object, which in this case, the enclosed space, is the intervention. And let me give you some examples. Anti-vaxxers, right? This fear of the vaccine. The idea that the mask, which prevents transmission, is a muzzle of free speech. The idea that CO2 is not a pollutant and a cause of climate change. What's going on here? I actually don't think, and it gets to Matt Jackson's earlier point about feeding people more data to cause them to change their minds. I think it's because they're suffering from complexity claustrophobia. I think people are living in a world that they very poorly understand. And what they then do is project their anxieties onto the interventions that other people might or might not understand. Typically, the reason why people feel this way is explained in terms of what I would call microbial explanations. They're highly reductive. This is a recent paper, relatively recent, on the science of why we don't believe in science. It's a review of many different positions, including Jonathan Haidt's and many others. And what you find is all of these papers explain this claustrophobia or anxiety in terms of psychological disposition. It's completely reductive. I think the real answer lies at the level of the hyperobject itself. And we need to shift towards what I'm going to call hyper-objective explanations, meaning an understanding of how the complex world works. Because if we don't do that, you don't deal with the primary cause, that is the anxiety of uncertainty.